So we're very much looking forward to hearing from our panellists. And I've got one simple question for all of them, which is to ask them to share your reflections on what changes we have seen over the past decade in relation to gender equality and social inclusion in and through education, and what are the priorities for going forward. So an easy question, and I'm sure you all have answers as well, but we'll start to hear from Amna. Over to you, Amna.
Thanks a lot, Pauline. I think every time Pauline says simple and easy, it makes me nervous. But I know we started the day talking about the challenges that are marring the educational landscape now, and it is a bleak but realistic picture of what we can expect in the coming years. But I think I'd like to talk about some of the more encouraging and positive things that have happened. And I think, like Bela was saying earlier, looking at the glass sort of half full. So reflecting on the debates and developments on gender and social inclusion in the past 10 years, I think I want to say three things. The first is that there has been increasing acknowledgement, realization, and generation of evidence that addressing issues of gender and social inclusion are critical to the human development agenda, and that social norms, which are also part of the title or theme for this panel, they have a significant role to play in that. So, for example, if you look at the Human Development Reports more recently, if you look at the 2019 report and also more recently the 2023 report, it does show us how gender social norms and the gender social norms index, it does show us how these social roles and power relations between men and women in society continue to drive inequalities in all spheres of living and being, including in education. And in fact, the latest report would tell us that social norms are potentially mediating some of the gains that are to be capitalized from reducing the gender gap in education. So one of the reasons or potential reasons that they do not translate into corresponding reductions in gender gaps in income is because we have this underlying strong effect of social norms, and particularly gender social norms. And then in terms of how the landscape has shifted, I think there has been, alongside increasing commitment to issue specifically gender social norms as well. So if you look at UNICEF's gender action plans more recently, or the World Bank's gender strategies, you realize that there is that acknowledgement of playing a greater role, a more active part in challenging harmful practices like child marriage, gender-based violence, etc., as well as promoting girls' agency. But one thing that I would add as a word of caution there is that these very well-meaning policies, programs, strategies, action plans, they do not always translate into the kind of impact that we want to see achieved. And just carrying forward that World Bank example, for instance, a very recent 2024 evaluation of their gender strategy shows that perhaps there have been gender transformative elements, but they've been restricted to fewer projects. And also that the focus has often overlooked the influence of social norms in helping bring about real change. Now, this is the evidence bit of it, I think, but I see real coming in here now. So how does that inform or motivate action? And I think over there, real, through its specifically its engagement in the consortium that was leading the independent evaluation of the Girls' Education Challenge, it has produced evidence to show what needs to be done, and also evidence on how it needs to be done. So for those of you in the room who are unaware, the Girls' Education Challenge is the FCDO's 12-year commitment to girls' education. It started in 2012. It cuts across 17 countries, has 41 projects, aiming to reach 1.6 marginalized girls. And one of the things that we've seen invariably across the studies, evaluation studies that have come out of it, is that social norms, community attitudes and norms are the most common barrier that girls and boys face in education, in their enrollment, in their attendance, in their progress at school. In the most recent study that I was also part of on sustainability, we saw that all these 17 projects in the program were looking to shift attitudes and practices towards a more sort of gender equal and inclusive world. And that speaks volumes in itself about how big a challenge this is, because it was invariably across these different contexts. I think the other thing that this evidence has shown is that there is two-way traffic. So there is that two-way link between education and shifting norms and empowerment. So, for instance, it's not just that we shift norms over time and we see better education and it stops there. No. We do create champions. We have, of course, we've been speaking about CAMFED and the power of female leadership. We do create champions. We do create change agents who then, leading by example, by inspiring their own communities, are able to further that positive change and enable lasting change. So it's clear, the evidence is clear that we need to be addressing social norms. And then real evidence has also showed how can we do that in a more sustained manner. So I was talking about this study on sustainability, where we saw that there are 3 key change pathways on which if you are, then you are more likely to result in positive and sustained change, especially for girls' education. So if you are working with and through communities, if you're leveraging, that kind of local ownership and support, if you are working with girls and young women, not as passive recipients, but as actual real change agents in the process themselves, taking control and agency, and if you're working in close partnership and sustained partnerships with governments, you are very likely to sustain positive impact. So I think it's important to realize that, but at the same time, evidence, for example, from the study that we are now conducting, as Pauline was mentioning, on the scaling of CAMFED's Learner Guide program in Tanzania, evidence also needs to be generated on what the challenges are in scaling. And I again think REAL has really been at the core of it, talking about what works and why, and in that sense, generating lessons learned for scalability and sustainability that can inform current and future programming as well. I'll just make 2 quick points on, I think, Pauline, what you posed in your question about what needs attention in the coming years. So I would say we need greater advocacy and continued advocacy on shifting social norms. I think we need to create hue and cry and noise around it, given the evidence that we have on how pervasive is its impact in the different political, economic, educational spheres and aspects of life. It is a global issue, so it's not like it's relegated to certain countries or certain people. It cuts across high and low income countries. It cuts across men and women, and that's why it's so important to address it and recognize it as a challenge of that scale. I was reading in the recent Human Development Report that it would take us almost 200 years, actually over that, to only close the gap in economic opportunity for men and women. And I think we heard in the morning from Julia Gillard some similar statistics telling us how far behind are we in our agenda to achieve gender equality and social inclusion. So I would just stop by saying that I think we need to, we spoke in the morning about how perhaps we can rethink our language and recalibrate and rethink our tactics and strategies to address these challenges. I think alongside what we need is more reflection on these change pathways that I was talking about. So we know what needs to be done thanks to the evidence that REAL has generated, as well as how it needs to be done. It's just a matter of now operationalizing it within context and understanding perhaps how those change pathways can unfold and how those mechanisms can unfold right at the grassroots level, working with communities, men and women, girls and boys themselves, to create a more gender equal and more socially inclusive world. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Over to you, Lucy.
Thanks, Pauline, and thanks, Amna. And all that you said was music to my ears. And I could just say ditto and leave it there and move to Sally. But I'll just put my notes, I think, to one side, therefore, and just take a step back and share some wider reflections. You said 10 years ago, and reflecting on the last 10 years, Pauline, but yeah, I think I want to just step back even further to 3 decades ago, 30 plus years ago, when we were first starting out in CAMFED. And at that time, the real focus of girls' education was on looking at those wider societal, social and economic benefits, the impact of girls' education on economic development, on maternal and child health, and also increasingly on combating climate change. One could argue that there's an instrumentalist agenda there, but I won't go down that road today. And then in the past decade, we've really had that focus on school level outcomes, what's happening at the school level, not just around enrolment, but around attendance, around retention, and around learning. And we heard some great examples of that earlier this morning, and with Baylor talking about the importance of data being shared back and how empowering that can in turn be in supporting local action to improve some of those outcomes. But if we think about those as being kind of concentric circles of impact, where we've got those school level outcomes in the middle, and then the wider outer circle of impact being those high level social and economic benefits, I think the real challenge is not that missing middle, but that relatively uncharted middle. What links the two? What can link those school level outcomes with those wider social and economic benefits, and not just link them, but really multiply and accelerate them? And that's what we were really focusing on in CAMFED, and saw women's leadership as a key connector in that agenda. And that was why we were very focused on setting up the CAMFED Association as being a critical vehicle to enable girls to transition successfully from school into that next stage, in that transition beyond. And then to work with the CAMFED Association to develop mechanisms like the Learner Guide programme, which again could be that important connector, and explore the issue of agency, which we saw as critical in bridging to those wider outcomes. But a lot of what we had was anecdotal. And I'm sure there were many times, and in the Real Centre, that I shared some great stories, some anecdotal evidence. I mean, one of those was around a learner guide, like Fatima said. This was Christine in Tanzania, and I remember her saying that through her role as learner guide, the respect that she had acquired within her community, that when she used to go to meetings with government officials, that first they said, "Who are you?" when she came in the room. Then one time when she didn't appear for one of those meetings, they said, "Where is she?" And that moved from "Who are you?" to "Where are you?" I think represents a critical transition. We had those anecdotes, but it was really through the research with the Real Centre that we were able to explore what is happening here. And I think that really brought home to us the importance of that rigorous research in that relatively uncharted territory in the middle between the school level outcomes and those wider economic and social benefits. So, Amna, what you were saying there around shifting gender social norms, I think that has been for us, and I will always say us at CAMFED, has been transformative for us to be able to explore that. And we are now really seeing the returns on that, in that the Ministry of Education in Tanzania is engaging with us to explore what are the factors that really can be embedded in the system to shift those gender social norms in the long term. And so in terms of priorities going forward, I would say it is in that relatively uncharted middle. That is where we will find the levers for system change. We mentioned, and Amna mentioned, the shifting gender social norms. Julia this morning mentioned the work on cost effectiveness, how the Real Centre, through their work with CAMFED, was able to demonstrate that it is cost effective to reach the most marginalised, and that if you do reach and focus on the most marginalised, it will result in an uplift for all children. So that relentless focus on gender equality and social inclusion, and the relentless rigour around the research to explore what those levers are for change, I think is what gives us the drivers, not just to connect the school level outcomes with those wider social and economic benefits, but also to inform policy that will ensure that we get there.
Great, thank you. Excellent linkages there. even if Amna had stolen all the thunder already.
Yeah, well, I know this. I think sorry, you're going to have nothing left to say by the end, because there's a couple of bits.
I don't believe that.
No, I don't either. Great. No, I just wanted to say though, first of all, it's absolutely delightful to be here and part of this panel. I mean, Pauline's an old friend, but also we've, I was around long enough before the Real Centre didn't exist, so I know the before and after and the counterfactual, and I certainly think the world's a better place because the Real Centre is here. And thank you for your impact on education research policy and most importantly practice, which I think the Real Centre gets right. It really does. I just wanted to say, after Amna's brilliant first intervention, that I'm very much speaking as a client for research. I don't claim to be a researcher at all. And in fact, I did sort of have a small flirtation with academia when Pauline and I were research assistants a good while ago. I won't say how long. And all I can say is Pauline is now Professor of International Education at Cambridge University, and I'm not of International Education at Cambridge University. So you know where I'm coming from. So I'm very much coming from as someone who has used data and evidence and very much benefited and been helped by it. So just a few short interventions. I think the first is really building on your point, Lucy, was looking back to when we were thinking about and designing the business case for the Girls' Education Challenge back in 2011. And as we had to do, and Rona can testify, I'm sure that's still the case, you have to write a very rigorous business case full of evidence to give to ministers. And so we did do quite a look at, what was available around girls' education. And actually, as Lucy said, there was a lot on the macro, the big picture, the impact. But in terms of the sort of how do you do it, policy making, it was still very qualitative. So there was a lot of really important qualitative research, and don't get me wrong, I'm a great fan. But what was missing was some of the sort of quantitative, robust RCT type of evidence. And I can say this in a mixed room, it was very gendered. Who was doing the RCTs and who wasn't. It was very much male and female divide. But I'm sitting next to someone who is a real pioneer as a sort of quantitative researcher on gender, and it makes a difference. As a policy maker, it really makes a difference because you can walk the talk and you're seeing it on equal level, and the level of your evidence is robust. So that's just a fantastic achievement over the last decade that we've seen that shift. I'd like to think part of it has been the faith the Girls' Education Challenge gave into evaluation and the resources put in, but it wasn't just that, it was across the globe. So I know we're all finding things too hard to celebrate, but I think that is definitely one of them. So that was just one point I wanted to make on the sort of evidence side of things. Other sort of pieces, I should have started off. I think if you'd asked me 10 years ago what this panel wouldn't have been called a Gender and Social Inclusion panel, it would have been called the Girls' Education panel. So I know Julia gave a good intervention earlier that gender is often, as assumed, means girls. But actually, I think we have moved a long way in our language and our understanding and bringing that intersectional lens. You can do that. If you talk about girls as a homogenous group and boys as a homogenous group, we've got ourselves into all sorts of pickles with policymakers and with and people who are not part of this world, who don't really understand why we just talk about girls' education. And so I think that's been a great step forward. So I just that was a sort of general point to make. And so I think we should celebrate that. Know there's been a lot of discussion about the uses of terminologies across the pond, etc. But I do feel we need to keep that analysis. Even if we find ways to say it differently for different audiences, we keep that analysis that we're really talking about gender, not just girls' education. So the other these are a bit random, sorry, Pauline. The next one, sort of thinking with a sort of cup half full. It's not, it's a bit of, it might sound weird, but bear with me, that there's been a lot of talk rightly, and it is terrible, and we recognise now that the issue of violence within schools, gender-based violence, is a huge issue, and it's something that we need to ensure that our work on foundational learning is not separated from, because I think people have made that point and connection that children aren't going to learn if they feel fearful and not safe. So we need to come together in a community to see the linkages. But I just wanted to say, in the time that I've been working as a policy maker, we couldn't, when I was a green young education advisor in DFID 15, 16 years ago, longer than that now actually, we couldn't talk about violence with policy decision makers. We weren't allowed to recognise it as an issue. We couldn't even discuss researching it or finding out the extent. And now I'm with the Global Partnership for Education. Over 50% of our partnership compacts, which are owned and signed by ministries of education, state very clearly that violence is a major issue and a barrier to learning in schools. Now that's only the start. But again, in the spirit of things and how things change, I know we're all feeling very frustrated, but that's, that has been a positive change, and that's the education community internationally and at national level as well, making sure that this issue is addressed and how important it is. Just last sort of reflection, and then I'll talk a little bit about going forward. Just to say that one of the things, again, there's been a lot of talk and I don't know what it is, cultural wars, whatever it is, this issue about language that we can and can't use, and we need to be careful. But I think there is something in there for us, particularly in the gender community, that we have got very jargonised in the way that we talk and the expressions that we use, and particularly when you translate those into different languages, something again I've learned having been a UK civil service and been very anglophone. Now I'm in an international organisation. It's been a really good lesson for me to realise how you can really land things in a bad way if you don't take attention to that. So certainly in the work that we're doing now, we're really thinking about, still talking about complex topics and subjects, but thinking about the way that we do it. And actually I was just thinking about the term intersectionality, Pauline, and I revisited your brilliant report that you did with colleagues for the Commonwealth celebrations. I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe longer, where you just this very simple chart that looked at urban, it was based on Pakistan data, it was boys who lived in urban areas and girls who lived in rural areas, and the percentage gap across Commonwealth countries. And that talked about intersectionality just in a picture, without using jargon or words. And so it was hugely powerful to me at the time as a policymaker. And so more of that would be great. And then in terms of going forward, just finally, so 10 more years of the Real Centre, please. I think that one of the things that I've really spotted, again, linked with gender intersectionality and where we got into a little bit of a pickle about, boys and girls and gender parity and why do we still need to talk about gender, because actually equal numbers of girls and boys are going into school, is the importance of disaggregated data under national level. And that, to me, could be, if we can support countries to be able to do that, to sex disaggregate data, and by disability, but at the sub-national level, and use that to inform decision making, that could be a real game changer on inequality, because every single country, once you start doing that, you see such a different pattern on gender in particular, and that usually when you walk into that room and a minister will say to you, well, actually we've got parity here, so what's your problem? Then you can actually have those charts, and I've seen that done very effectively. And then just an area, something that I've just been following and looking at the research, is this issue about diversity in school leadership. And some really interesting research about the importance of female leaders, even when you've got a very strong feminised workforce, but equally in a country, and we see this here in the UK, when you have a predominantly female workforce for the boys, also not seeing that a difference. So I think that's sort of where my intention is. I think we could have a big focus on that. Thanks very much.
The disaggregated data that you mentioned the analysis was by Dr. Ben Olcott, who I think is somewhere here, and he was using PAL network data.
Oh, well,
so
there you go.
A nice segue through. Over to you, Sarah.
And perhaps I begin from there, though of course you have threatened that I may not have anything much to say, which is true. So maybe I begin by giving a story. And it's a story of the Real Centre and evidence, but how they did it differently. Because when we started the PAL network, we had all these huge data sets. And Pauline, Ben, Ricardo was not yet there, I think at that time, said, we want to analyze this data to see whatever else insights it can give. And I think that was very powerful. So instead of beginning from a deficit mentality, or stating that, oh, that data is collected by volunteers, therefore it might not be good, it was like, that data is there. What can we do about it to see what else we can learn? It was collected by and accepted where it is. How do we further on the discussion? And I think that generosity, that collaborativeness, you can say I'm trying to bring in all the values that came with this very simple decision, allowed knowledge to grow, allowed evidence data to be produced in a way that it can be used. And that is why when Pauline, you said that it's a real center at 10, I had to come because it was not just about evidence, but also about friendship over the years. And I couldn't miss out being in this particular space where you celebrate something that has been done well and look back and then look forward to what else we need to do. So to everybody here at the Real Center and under Pauline's leadership, really a warm, warm congratulations. So what changes have we seen? I think there's some good and some that perhaps we want to urge ourselves to go faster. And the first that I'd like to raise, which has sort of been a running thread from the morning, was what I'm now calling the growing distance between what evidence is saying and what the heart is reacting to. And Julia, I think in the morning, for those of you who are paying attention, what did she say? She said that there seem to be some hardened attitudes against girls, hardened. Am I speaking English that way? Hardened, right? And if you came to my part of the world, as soon as you say something, even, it's not dangerous. You just say, girls, before you even finish your sentence, the rebound will be, what about boys? And so that makes us wonder, why is it that, there's been all this beautiful evidence presented in visual ways that make sense, logically stating that there is some unfairness here. Things could be done this way. But the first reaction you get is, what about boys? We are tired of girls, And I think it is important for us to think about it and to see what we need to do. Is it in the language that we have used? Is it that sometimes the particular disadvantage, we have followed a girl's agenda. Like I remember one program which went to an area that was very needy and had a feeding program for girls. And then the girls would go and eat and the boys would be left looking. And so that sometimes when we are trying to address a disadvantage, we maybe slipped a little bit in terms of a human approach towards it. So I think it is important for us to look at what we could be better so that we do not have flimsy reasons taking away what is still a justifiable course to follow. Why in some areas you need to look at girls. They are faced against patriarchy, against culture, against, their own physiological makeup that makes them more vulnerable. And that the solutions for boys' disadvantaged, girls' disadvantaged, sometimes differ, often differ. They need to be solutions. So I think we need to really address this to borrow Julia's word, these hardened attitudes, this what about boys, so that we do not take away the gains. And there have been a number of gains and beautiful gains. There have been gains in policy. I do not think in Africa, maybe in every other country, there is no policy, gender and education policy. There have been gains in terms of curriculum reforms. The curriculum reforms we have had, for example, in Kenya, have opened the way of thinking about life skills, of bringing in certain issues that we would not have considered before, of making the space for the learner guides to get their entry, not just in the school as a co-curricular activity, but in the classroom. Now, those are really beautiful gains. So we don't want to lose them because of a broader fight that is going on. Another change that in the last 10 years, what I feel, and I'm mainly talking from a Kenyan perspective, maybe an East African perspective, is that the movement, the women's movement, is not as strong as it was. There was a time, and that time I was younger, when there was Beijing, there was the Dakar conference, and a group of men and women, but it was the women who led and brought together a number of ministers. And most of the ministers at that time were men. But you know, Matiba, who was a man, when he went to Dakar to fight, identified himself as a girl and said, and this is why as girls, we want this. And we were saying, oh wow, this man is saying as girls. You no longer see that. And so we need to use the evidence that we are coming out, what Pauline, Ben, everybody is giving us, to see how do we use this, not just in the logical way, but to use this information to build movement, because movement will bring everybody together. And the siloed approach is not helping us. So there was something that happened before. I'm seeing less of it, and it would be great if we would see a way in which we would build this movement, a movement that supported girls. And I'm still unapologetically. In fact, my friend said, the reason I have 3 sons, and my friend said, the reason you have 3 sons because you'd have been insufferable. But it's simply because somebody needs to still fight for the girl, and I've chosen that as my battle. Building this movement, I think, will help. So that, as I come to my final point, when we have various tools, and one of the tools that we use in our place of work is the gender marker. Mm-hmm. I like tools because they help to give you clarity in terms of where you are and where you're going. So as you have stated, for example, we have seen a bit of growth in terms of having data that is no longer just blanket, that so many children, it is so many girls, so many boys did this and that. That helps you to track. So we have had that movement, that access data, disaggregated data is a good plus. And you don't want to ever lose it. And while it is good, it is like a stepping stone. It is important then to look at how can we be a little bit more intentional in the things we are doing. Like, for example, there must be a reason why girls and boys start off similar in their basic literacy numeracy. There must be a reason why, at least in East Africa, in Africa, the higher up girls go, the less their STEM, science, math scores are. It cannot be because of intelligence. It probably is because of pedagogy. Maybe there are gendered messages that are happening in the class. And so how then do we become more intentional in our pedagogies before you go to transforming a society in which we are fair for both boys and girls? So we have seen a number of tools coming up, and we need to encourage them. These tools have been informed by research, they have been informed by evidence, but we cannot sit on our laurels, because something is happening today that is challenging, is stopping the growth we have had. When I look at when the orders to stop funding, cease funding happened, it was gender, diversity, then education, and you ask yourself why. Is it people, the elites, fighting back? Then if that is the case, then all of us in the room are called upon to remove our tools of fairness, of justice, because all of us, I'm sure, want the best for our children, our siblings, our nieces. But you can be sure that an unfair world will also be a bad world for them. And so even if we are self-serving, at least the one thing we need to know is that it is imperative for our own survival and those of the ones behind us to be a little bit fairer. And it is this gender justice that is sort of slipping away, and we need to find ways using research and evidence. That was very important, but also ourselves, how we can build movement to yield a better society. And last but not least, at least for those of us who are in Africa, one of the things is whenever you say something, people will quickly say, that happens in the West. Don't bring us those things of the West. And so, in our context, for those of us who come from East Africa, Kenya, I think it is very important to look back into the indigenous systems. Indigenous culture, knowledge were much fairer than what we are seeing today. We need more practical examples of the contexts in which the work is being done. And I think that will be our arsenal to say, actually, no, you're wrong. An example I always use, and I'm stopping there, she's been looking at me, smiling. An example I always use, for example, is the Kiswahili as a language is a very gender-inclusive language. So when you are chairing a meeting, the Kiswahili term is mwenyekiti, the holder of the seat. It doesn't matter if the holder of the seat is a child or a grown-up or a man or a woman. As long as you're the holder of the seat, you have the power to call the meeting into order. But when we are using the English language, how does that term, what's the term that is used? It is chairman. And I always tell people, do I look like a man? No offense to you. Because why do we have to appropriate, this gender, and it's true, most of the people who hold that seat are normally chairmen. So that's why I say language is also important. And one needs to go back to language because it also shares the culture, the norms. And perhaps it can offer an opportunity for certain communities that are losing the gender way. Go back to your language. Some of the languages you can pull out beautiful things that happened, and not very beautiful things, but use the beautiful things to build a fairer world. Thank you very much.